Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm Robin Puglia. I'm the VP of Education for Cyrex Labs for the UK, Ireland and Europe. In this video, I'm going to be providing an overview of all of the tests that we have. This is not an in-depth profile of any of the individual arrays. Those will be provided in other videos. But if you're new to Cyrex and you haven't used any of their panels before, and you're wondering which tests we offer and which profile looks at which analyte, then this information will help you. So within Cyrex, we're starting to look now at the triad of autoimmunity. So in order to develop an autoimmune disease in the first place, you need to have the genetic predisposition, an environmental trigger, and some degree of immune system dysregulation, which is often preceded by barrier permeability. So we often talk about the three legs of the stool being intestinal permeability, genetics, and environmental trigger. But it is a little bit more complex than that. So we now know, for example, that it can be any of the mucosal barriers or the immune barriers, not just the gut. So it's possible to have autoimmune disease without having leaky gut, for example, which is not necessarily that well known. And when you have those three, the intersection of those three variables allows for autoimmune disease to develop. So within Cyrex, we have the Cyrex system, which is building on those principles. So the Cyrex system is comprised of three integrated categories for assessing autoimmunity once it's been established, or in order to detect it early in the patient that you're working with. So we look at antibodies to tissue, which is a hallmark of autoimmunity. So the loss of tolerance to self-tissue is identified with antibodies to that tissue. And we know that there are three stages of autoimmunity, and that the first stage, which is silent autoimmunity, antibodies are present, but there are no symptoms and diagnosis isn't possible. However, we also know that it's a spectrum. So from then on, unless a problem is identified and addressed, that person is on the road to developing an end-stage autoimmune disease. We also know, though, that stage 1 happens many years, if not even decades, before diagnosis is possible. So antibodies have been present for 10 or even 20 years before a diagnosis of something like lupus or multiple sclerosis. So understanding how to use predictive antibody panels and when you would be running that panel on somebody with a diagnosed autoimmune disease or somebody who you're trying to identify early is a really important part of the Cyrex system, and also for us supporting you as a clinician to do the best for your patient population. So we also look at the essential barriers. So of all of the mucosal surfaces at the moment, we have testing that looks at 2 of those barriers. So barrier permeability and the resultant immune dysregulation and inflammatory cascades that occur are of course fundamental to the development of autoimmunity. And lastly, we look comprehensively at 3 of the 4 categories of immune triggers. So the 4 categories are foods, toxins, infections, and stress, or stress and trauma, which of course you cannot measure antibodies to. So we look in a really in-depth, comprehensive way at foods, infections, and toxins. So within the umbrella of those 3 categories of tests, we also have panels that span the 3 categories, such as our mucosal immune panel, which is called Array 14, and also the Alzheimer's links panel, which incorporate all of those things within a single test. So in the barrier permeability category, we have Array 2, which looks at the gut, and Array 20, which looks at the blood-brain barrier. So this is what Array 2 looks like. It includes 3 analytes that investigate transcellular permeability, paracellular permeability via tight junctions, and also assesses endotoxin, or LPS, which is one of the critical features of this test, as it helps us to better understand what the actual immune consequences of permeability are. So this is really a groundbreaking panel. It's completely different to all of the other intestinal permeability panels available on the market. And I'm really excited to dive deeper into this test with you in the Array 2 education pathway. So Array 20 is the other barrier surface that we currently measure permeability to, or in. This is a really important panel to run on any kind of fatigue. any mood disorder or mood fluctuation issue, brain fog, brain endurance issues, or anybody who exhibits changes in cognitive function or who has neurological autoimmunity or neurological autoimmune symptoms such as peripheral neuropathy. This is also an important panel to run on anybody that plays a contact sport in which repeated head trauma occurs. Anyone that engages in activity that involves force or shock to the body and or the head, such as gymnastics, for example, or anybody with intestinal permeability with abnormal elevation of LPS or potentially occludin zonulin antibodies. So next we look at immune triggers, and we have multiple panels that scan the 3 categories of immune triggers that we can measure antibodies to. So first we look at food or dietary protein reactivity. So Cyrex actually has multiple panels that assesses food immune reactivity. We have Array 3, which looks at wheat and gluten. We have Array 4, which looks comprehensively at dairy and dairy proteins, and also includes foods that are found on the gluten-free diet that have the ability to cross-react with gluten, foods that are commonly consumed or over-consumed on the gluten-free diet, and some of the more common allergens as well. And lastly, we have a groundbreaking panel, Array 10, which looks at 180 foods. So this panel has been fundamental in changing the way that we understand and assess food in the context of autoimmune disease. It's revolutionary, and from a personal perspective, it is the #1 test that I use in my own clinical practice. So as well as food, of course, we're also looking at immune triggers. We're looking at infectious agents and toxins. So these panels help us to understand the role of environmental toxins, which of course are ubiquitous and play a significant role in breaking down barrier permeability and breaking tolerance. And it also helps us to have a look at infectious agents, which are an integral part of our immune relationship with our environment. And of course, infectious agents are possibly one of the most researched areas when it comes to triggers of autoimmunity. Okay, so Array 3 is our wheat and gluten proteome reactivity and autoimmunity panel. So you can see here that there are multiple different markers, not just to gluten, but also to wheat, to non-gluten proteins within wheat, and to some of the breakdown products of gluten that may interact in a negative way with the body, such as gluteomorphins. This panel also looks at multiple markers of autoimmunity. So it measures multiple antibodies to tissue, transglutaminase 2, which is associated with celiac disease, transglutaminase 3, which is associated with skin gluten-reactive autoimmunity of the skin, and transglutaminase 6, which is associated with gluten-reactive autoimmunity of the central nervous system, such as gluten ataxia. We also look at microbial transglutaminase, which is an antigen found in food and food processing, and looks at the gliadin transglutaminase complex, which helps us really connect the dots between the consumption of gluten and the immune reactivity which occurs, and the antibody reactivity as well. Okay, so after Array 3, we have Array 4. So Array 4, to my mind, is the dairy equivalent to Array 3. We know that dairy is one of the top immune triggers, and it's very, very important to assess the immune relationship to dairy foods in the context of autoimmune disease. However, this panel also looks beyond dairy and assesses many foods that are contained in the gluten-free diet. So this includes the ingredients of gluten-free products and processed foods, and also things such as breads and cakes and muffins, but also naturally gluten-free foods that are often consumed even on a non-processed gluten-free diet. This panel also includes soy and eggs, as they are common allergens. So this is a panel that can be run alongside Array 3 to fully assess many of the top 8 or top 10 allergens. It can also be run for people who are on the gluten-free diet but who are still exhibiting symptoms or seeking to improve their health further. This panel, of course, is called gluten-associated cross-reactive foods, and I will discuss the cross-reactivity part of this panel in more detail in the webinar that is focused solely on this panel. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so Array 10 is our panel that looks at 180 foods, and it is honestly the most used panel in my own practice. So if you are using food as a tool in your clinical practice and you're working with autoimmunity, then you cannot afford for this not to be one of your top profiles as well. So this panel measures IgG and IgA reactivity to food proteins, and it has fundamentally changed the way we understand the relationship between food and autoimmunity, because it takes us beyond the generalities of the autoimmune diet or an anti-inflammatory diet, and we can now assess the inflammatory and autoimmune trigger for the individual, because we now learn that any food can be a trigger, including foods that we encourage on healing diets, such as turmeric or oily fish or green leafy vegetables, or anything. So if you're using food as a tool with autoimmune disease, you cannot assume that any food is healing or beneficial. You can't assume that. Just because it has anti-inflammatory properties from a nutritional biochemistry perspective doesn't mean that the interaction with that food and that person's immune system is going to have a favorable outcome. So if you're using food as a tool and you're working with autoimmunity, you need to assess, if you can, the individual relationship between these foods as antigens and the immune system, and the way that tolerance to the foods works, and also the foods as a direct driver of inflammation and autoimmunity for that individual. Okay, so then on to Array 11. So Array 11 assesses chemical immune reactivity. This is different to total toxic load or body burden. This panel doesn't assess the amount of toxin in the body, but instead it actually assesses the immune tolerance or immune reactivity to that chemical. The other important thing to understand about this panel is that it's an antibody panel, and chemicals themselves are too small to elicit an antibody response. So in order to be positive on this test, the chemical must be bound to human tissue, and it is this new compound that elicits the immune response. So we're taking it a step further than just the chemical itself. We're looking to see that the chemical has bound to the tissue in the person you're working with, and that that an immune response has been created to that neoantigen. And as a result of that, the antibodies attached to that protein are creating a T cell response, which is driving inflammation and tissue damage in the protein as a direct result of the exposure to the chemical. So in this way, we see not the presence of the chemical in the environment or the chemical in the body, but its role in immune dysregulation and autoimmunity specifically. It's also important to know that the chemicals found on this panel are not, they're not chemicals that are found only in extreme circumstances. These are not chemicals that are found only if you're working on a farm or only if you're working in a plant. These are the chemicals that we are all in contact with every day. They're not novel. They're the chemicals that are found in our homes, in our personal care products, and in the air that we breathe, and potentially also in our mouths. So understanding, again, this is a really fundamental shift around working with people with autoimmunity, and it's one of the go-to panels. You need to assess this in everybody who has an autoimmune disease at some point in your journey with them. Because if someone with an autoimmune disease has antibodies to BPA bound to their own albumin, then that person's relationship with BPA is similar to a celiac's relationship with gluten. It is that serious and needs to be taken that seriously. But of course, you need to assess all of the chemicals. You can't just assume that somebody has a BPA issue, because their issue might be with benzene rings, or their issue might be with phthalates or formaldehyde. So understand, because it's such a big process to go through, removing the chemicals from the environment, you need to be very specific about which chemicals are causing a problem, and understanding then which interventions you're going to make as a result of that knowledge. So then after array 11, we have array 12, which is our pathogen screen. So of course, humans are designed to live with a vast multitude of infectious agents of all kinds in our bodies and in our environments. But in the context of autoimmunity, we know that this relationship can be fraught with problems, and infectious agents are well researched and really well understood trigger and perpetuator of autoimmune disease and also of inflammation in the body. So this panel assesses a range of common pathogens that are directly implicated in autoimmune disease, for example, via the mechanism of molecular mimicry. And it's very useful for assessing not just the individual antigens, but also for a larger view on the relationship between this person's body and their microbial body. So the third leg of the stool is tissue damage and autoimmune activation. And we have several panels that measure tissue antigens, including Array3, which is the gluten reactivity panel, and our Alzheimer's links panel. But Array5 is our groundbreaking 24 antibody panel. Excuse me. We also have a series of smaller subsets of Array5, which look solely at the markers for autoimmune diabetes, neurological tissue, and autoimmune arthritis. So Array5 is a truly important panel for a variety of reasons. So 25% roughly of people who are diagnosed with one autoimmune disease proceed to be diagnosed with a secondary or a tertiary one. And I suspect that the true numbers are actually higher than that because conventionally, the search for answers often stops once a diagnosis is made. But autoimmunity is a global systemic immune issue. It will affect one single tissue, but not necessarily only one tissue. So we know that tissue antibodies are present in stage 1 and 2 of autoimmune development and can be seen for 10 years or even longer before diagnosis is possible at stage 3. So screening early is helpful for early identification, which allows us as practitioners to intervene early, which helps us to have better outcomes in clinic. So this panel looks at 24 tissue antibodies from common autoimmunities and also autoimmune families. This is also a very important panel for assessing children and first-degree family members of people who have a diagnosed autoimmune disease, because again, early detection is key for prevention of further problems down the line. So from Array5, which looks at the 24 antibodies, we have the 3 breakdown panels. So Array6 just looks at the diabetes markers, insulin and islet cell antibodies, and also glutamic acid decarboxylase. Array7 and 7X look at neurological autoimmune markers. So they're just looking at the neurological tissues found on Array5. And 7X is an expanded panel that uses all of the same antigens, but also measures IgM. So useful if somebody has had a recent head trauma. And then lastly, we have Array8, which is the joint autoimmune reactivity screen. So these panels are useful if you're really just wanting to know information about a single individual issue, such as neurological autoimmunity or joint autoimmunity, or you're running follow-up testing following the findings of the original Array5 markers. So we also have some panels that look at specific conditions. So we have the irritable bowel screen, or irritable bowel SIBO autoimmune screen, and then we also have Alzheimer's links. So Array2, the irritable bowel SIBO screen, looks at the relationship with autoimmune disease and SIBO, or irritable bowel. So if a patient has irritable bowel and they exhibit symptoms of malabsorption, including weight loss or anemia or fatty stools, or they have associated conditions such as fatigue, reflux, skin disorders, obesity, or food intolerance, then this panel is looking at 2 specific markers, IgG, IgA, and IgM, to understand the immune relationship between the microbial ecology of the small intestine, which of course is where most of the immune cells in the gut are found, is in that small intestine, and the autoimmune process. And then lastly, we have the Alzheimer's associated immune reactivity screen. Now this is an absolutely beautiful test, and I really hope that we're going to see more and more panels like this come available on the market, because this test really looks at all of the proteins that are associated with autoimmune disease and changes in cognition down that pathway. But apart from that, this test has investigated all of the different cross-reactivities. So we're looking at the proteins to the brain associated with Alzheimer's itself. We're looking at the growth factors, so looking at the environment around neurological function, looking at enteric nerves, enzymes, and neurological peptides. So really looking in depth at all of the tissues and all of the different functional organ systems that are involved in cognition and dementia. And then this test really takes it to the next level and has assessed for all of the different antigens, so foods, environmental antigens, so foods, chemicals, and pathogens that cross-react with any of those tissues. So cross-react with the brain proteins, cross-react with the growth factors, or cross-react with the nerves. And so in one panel, you can look at every single relevant marker that is related to that specific amino acid sequence that is specific to that person. You know, this is just an absolutely beautiful way of thinking about autoimmunity. It's an absolutely beautiful way of investigating autoimmunity. And again, I really hope that we see one of these panels for each of the 80 autoimmune diseases at some point. But Alzheimer's is definitely a good place to start. And then finally, we have what's called the GAM. So it's looking at the total immunoglobulins, IgG, IgA, and IgM. And this can be included as an add-on to any of the Cyrex panels that you run in order to help you have a better understanding of the context of the immune system. So if somebody has IgA deficiency and that wasn't known going into running the tests, then you can run this alongside your panel to feel really confident that you understand how to interpret the results that you're seeing in front of you. So that is an overview of all of our tests. Thank you very much for your attention today. I hope you found that useful. For more information on each of the panels, please dive into each of the different sections on Array 3, Array 2, Array 4, Array 10, and I will be taking you on an in-depth journey to each of the tests to help you really understand the analytes and the interpretation and how to use that information in the context of your clinical practice. Thank you so much for your attention.